So, I want to go into some detail in this portion of the program about Besant and Leadbeater's contribution to teachings on initiation. In particular, some things that Annie Besant said about various aspects of these teachings that I think are very relevant for us today. Here are pictures of Besant and Leadbeater from the middle of the 1890s to about early 1900. The key words during this period were masters and Mahatmas, to talk about the higher spiritual teachers. The idea of probation, which meant that you were put on probation. In other words, you were being tested for your readiness for some kind of spiritual teaching from a master. Discipleship meant that you were accepted in order to get this teaching. And initiation would be measuring the stages of your experience and progression through being taught. So here's what Annie Besant had to say about masters or Mahatmas. Human beings who have perfected themselves and have nothing more to learn on earth, who live in physical bodies on earth for the helping of humanity, who take pupils that desire to evolve more rapidly in order to serve it, and are willing to forsake all for this purpose. This came from her book on the Masters. Now, they don't actually only live on the physical plane. There are also non-physical beings that could be considered masters or higher spiritual teachers. That's something we can talk about later. So what is meant by probation or discipleship? Again, Annie Besant. When people, by their own efforts, utilizing to the full all the general help coming to them through religion and philosophy. This is our second object of the Theosophical Society, comparative study of science, religion, and philosophy. When these people have struggled onwards to the front of the advancing human wave, and when they show a loving, selfless, helpful nature, here's our first object, universal brotherhood. Then they become a special object of attention to the watchful guardians of humanity. And opportunities are put in their way to test their strength and call forth their intuition. That is our third object, the latent powers in humanity. And this comes from Annie Besant's The Ancient Wisdom. You know how television shows often have a laugh track so that the audience knows when to laugh at a joke? I think that's what our angels are doing, except it's not about laughter. They want everyone to say, ah, and ooh, about these things. Because I've noticed it's interesting exactly when they decide to make these noises. I almost want to gesture to them and say, okay, laugh track, maybe we'll call it the Om track. Ooh. So here's what Annie Besant had to say on initiation. Initiation is an extension of consciousness that allows us to gain new powers to be exercised, as well as a new world in which those powers can be exercised. What she means by a new world is referring to the theosophical idea that there are various planes of being. We've got our well-known physical plane, then we have an astral or emotional plane, a mental plane, and a causal or soul level of being, among others. So each time we experience an initiation, we may enter into one of these other worlds. Leading up to any initiation, says Annie Besant, is a long preparation during which powers are being gradually evolved, which enable us to grasp what is called the key of knowledge and turn it in the lock that opens to us a new world for study. Let me go back to that for a moment. There's an implication here that in order to enter these worlds, we have to have some form of credentials. Obviously, these credentials won't be a diploma from the school of initiation. My theory is that there has to be something in our aura or energy field that indicates that we're qualified to take that step. I've often encountered beings in non-physical reality during astral travels that I call gatekeepers. And they usually are standing at a desk, something like you would find with customs. And they look at your aura as your passport and then decide whether you're allowed to go in or not. And so in order to take these steps, there's a need for some form of qualification, but it's the qualification of inner experience, so that you actually, when you go across to this new world, you're able to directly experience and understand what goes on there. Andy Besant has an interesting definition of samadhi. That's supposed to be one of the high spiritual states that is talked about in Hinduism and under a slightly different name in Buddhism. So her idea is that, actually it's Leadbeater's idea. I'm sorry, for years I've said it was Besant, and then I recently realized it was Leadbeater. Leadbeater says that samadhi represents a state of consciousness beyond the point where we can bring anything back from it. So the idea is the bliss of samadhi that everyone hears about as something that you can experience in meditation is a kind of blankness, and that there's actually a whole world there to be perceived. So samadhi indicates that you've taken a step into a new state of consciousness, but you actually may not have developed the inner senses that allow you to directly experience what's happening in that consciousness. So samadhi is almost like an introduction to a state, whereas I think most people think of it as some kind of final step in a meditative or initiatory process. Continuing, Andy Besant says, the tests that precede initiation involve exercising the various forces and energies of the world we're about to enter. And we must demonstrate that we have the knowledge that brings them under control. This comes from a book of lectures from 1913 called Superhuman Men in History and Religion. Again, for a long time out of print. So what are the key points from what I've just brought forward here? There is a long preparation. The idea of going to a seminar where you'll spend a weekend with someone and experience an initiation might be a little ambitious. Powers are being evolved. There is a constant testing for strength and control of these powers. An expansion of consciousness will develop as a part of this. There will probably be access to a new energy body and its powers, and also, of course, to a new plane. Entry into a new world or plane with new beings and responsibilities. And I want to emphasize that in all the theosophical teachings I've seen, the only purpose for initiation is to take on more duties with respect to service to the world, under the impression that as you develop higher powers, it's not ever, this is my phrasing, but I think it's theosophically approved, it's not ever power over others, it's always power under others. In other words, support. So as long as we are living from this place of developing spiritual powers to be in support of others. I believe that we are safe and the people that we're supporting are safe. And then the cycle repeats itself at higher levels. Now, people get confused with spiritual status. So there are a lot of initiation sequences in different spiritual groups that sound appealing, especially to people who want more power, but also people who want the status of being able to say that they are a third or a fifth or a 20th level initiate. And I think there is danger in this way of thinking, primarily because, from the perspective of the higher powers that guide the evolution of the planet, if they see someone saying, I'm an 8th level initiate, they'll say, well, let's see, the job description for that is X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, and F. How many of those can they do all at once tomorrow? And then the person is overwhelmed because, of course, they've made a claim that they can't actually fulfill. So I have pity for people who brag about their spiritual level of initiation. In any case, they only really want attention to themselves, because if they really were such an initiate and they really were bragging about it, the world would bang on their door and they'd be completely incapable of doing anything helpful for the world, because they would be overwhelmed by everybody's glamorous ideas of who they are. Some people might be satisfied by that, but I think the real initiates work behind the scenes, because it's the only way you can get the work done, by not being noticed. So, also I think it's appropriate to tell a joke that I heard Tim Boyd tell before he was International President of the Theosophical Society. He said there was a theosophical retreat and two people were sitting together and having breakfast. And one of them said, I had the most amazing dream this morning. It was the second initiation. And the other one said, I had the most amazing dream 7 years ago, and it was the fourth initiation. So we have to be careful not to get caught up in that kind of thing. Okay, so this is my last slide, and then I would love to take questions. What is initiation really? From my perspective, it's a means of tracking spiritual progress on our journey back to Source. So, teachings on initiation provide models of spiritual progress with guidelines, rules, and signposts to help us find or mark our way. They're only valid to the extent that they inspire us to achieve an ever-increasing capacity for service and teaching, healing, and guiding others. So, this is our stopping point for now. Any questions? Please wait till the microphone comes your way.
I believe it was the last slide where it mentions the new world opening. In what way would that manifest?
Okay. Something I'll talk about in more detail during the workshop session that comes tomorrow afternoon is how there are 3 different paths that people can follow on their journey back to Source. As I mentioned last night, there's a path for mystics, and these tend to be fascinated by the laws and the powers of the universe. And then there's a path for people that I call empaths. These are the loving, devoted, healing types of individuals. And then there's a path for the seers, who are the ones who essentially become guides to the different levels of being. The purpose of the guides is to help people get from one place to another based on what their spiritual growth requirements are. So Besant was primarily talking about the kind of state of consciousness that opens access to a new non-physical body and non-physical plane. And emphasizing that once you get to that higher level of being, there are beings there who may need you in some way, and there are things that you need to do and learn in order to perceive them and to work with them to help them satisfy their spiritual needs. So I'll go into this in much more detail later, but for people on this path, the path of the seer, I believe there are 7 stages, and each stage is a degree of mastering the body in order to perceive and then work on that particular plane. So I think the description of this particular path, the path of the seer, is very much aligned with Andy Besant's words in that slide. So I'll have a slide for this in that presentation, but my understanding of the chakras is they are a reflection of the level or stage of development of each of the bodies. So the first chakra is often associated with survival, and in the context that I'm using it, I call it embodiment. It means that you have the awareness that you're present in a different body on a different plane, but there may be nothing else. Then the second stage is often called sexuality or sensuality, with the second chakra. In my way of thinking, it's the stage beyond embodiment where the inner senses reach out and start to make contact with the reality of the new plane. And then the third chakra is usually described in connection with will, and I think of it as the motivational force that allows us to move from one place to another. The fourth is the heart center. This gives us the power of empathy so that we can feel or know the existence of another being as a being, know what its needs are, whether it's less developed or equally developed or more developed than we are, and what kind of behavior will be involved in with respect to them. Also, whether they're physical or non-physical, whether they're human or non-human, whether they are alive or dead in the terms that we usually think of these. That all comes through the fourth chakra. Then the fifth chakra is the ability to communicate with these beings, which means knowing what they have to tell us and being able to speak to them in some way that they're able to absorb. The sixth chakra is about synthesis, which means taking all of the inner sense data from the other chakras and constructing it into a consistent view of the plane, where you're able to perceive structures, beings, energy fields, states of consciousness, and navigate between them. And then finally, the seventh chakra is the task of dissolving what I call the perceptual biases of that particular body, which limit us to living from that body, so that we can enter into a more expanded version of our being on the next higher plane, in the next higher body. So that gives you maybe a general idea of what's involved. And as I mentioned, I'll go into more detail another time. Another question? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kurt, for everything. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about probation, the phase of probation.
Yes. That comes this afternoon. I have a number of slides about that, including the different stages or steps that are involved with it. So I will leave that for then. Yes. Here's one.
Hi Kurt, during the retreat, are you going to talk about more in details about the occult hierarchy up to the Lords of the Flame, for example?
Very briefly, in the afternoon, I'll mention their existence. This is something that actually it's possible to read about in one of the things that I intend to send to everybody. I mentioned how there's a book called A Short History of the Theosophical Society, and about 15 pages that provides a very brief, clear description of all the different levels of the occult hierarchy. I hesitate to do that myself because it's abstract, the names are unusual, the functions are embedded in the context of the secret doctrine in a way that would take us away from focusing on initiation. But that text is wonderful, and it's something that you could circulate if you wanted to once you have gotten hold of it, or translate even. I'm sure that many people would be interested. I was talking to Wei Wei earlier about her work within China in spreading theosophical ideas. It's quite interesting. So I hope that helps. Yes, you're welcome. It's good that people are throwing out suggestions about what they hope to be included, because Arne mentioned a particular Blavatsky text that will be useful to bring to people's attention. So I'm certainly open to that idea, as long as it doesn't take us too far afield. Here's one.
My name is Marjan Prokker. I'd like to ask you, Rudolf Steiner has written a lot about older initiations, ancient initiations, and the very special change which happened with the coming of Christ. Is that also to be found in the works of Besant and Leadbeater, or didn't they? Well, they didn't really see eye to eye, but is there something, a connection with these things that Steiner wrote?
Yes. So we have to start with Blavatsky. Blavatsky brought the idea of Buddhism, and in particular esoteric Buddhism, into Western esoteric discourse. And this was not popular among Western esotericists because it was something new. And yet there were many people who found value in it. And then Besant did something of the same thing with Hindu ideas. And once again, there were people in the Theosophical Society that said, neti, neti, Sanskrit for not that, not that. And then Steiner himself was very strongly involved with a branch of Western esotericism called Rosicrucianism, which is essentially Christ-based. Now, the whole idea behind Theosophy is that all of the world's religions, which would include all of their esoteric teachings, have the same basis. And all you're really doing is changing the terminology. And that would have been the standpoint of Blavatsky and Besant. With Rudolf Steiner, there was a very strong belief, literally, that the world was changed by the presence of Christ and that the old ways were no longer valid. And you can see that in a variety of ways. It can be a way of differentiating his teachings from the theosophy of Blavatsky and Besant. It could also be a universal truth, which means everyone has to be a Rosicrucian, which perhaps is not exactly what Steiner meant, but the implication is there. There really was quite a battle about the idea of avatara in the Theosophical Society during the period when Besant and Steiner were working together in the Theosophical Society. We know the word as avatar. It has multiple meanings, some of which are not relevant. But in Hinduism, an avatar was the coming of a world teacher for the purpose of beginning a new religion or a reform of a previous religion, because the Dharma, in other words, the knowledge of the law, had fallen on hard times, and it needed to be renewed. And there are at least a dozen of these avatars described in Hinduism, Krishna being one of them, and there's an expectation of another one to come at some point. And then in Buddhism, there are many Buddhas that preceded Gautama Buddha, and there will be many following. So the same idea is present there. And Maitreya Buddha is said to be the Bodhisattva who will eventually incarnate as the world teacher Buddha. And then we have Christ also with the idea of a second coming of Christ. Very similar idea. And then John the Baptist preceding Christ in the same way that there were earlier Buddhas or earlier versions of Krishna. So during the early 20th century, the Theosophists were quite interested in possible ways in which all of these could be expressions of the same basic idea. And essentially it was that plan that developed the idea in Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater of seeing if it was possible, in a sense, to create and train a world teacher in the form of Krishnamurti. If not for Krishnamurti to be the world teacher, then for Krishnamurti to be a vessel for a manifestation of the world teacher that could somehow give guidance in the hard times that people were going through after the First World War. And this was tied in with Maitreya. So supposedly, Maitreya was the same spiritual being as Christ and Krishna. And this was the world teacher that would come through, Krishnamurti, and eventually change the world. Now, Steiner was quite against this, and there were a variety of reasons. Rosicrucianism being centered on Christ, and there already being a tradition of a second coming of Christ to be expected. But also, in his mind, it was absolutely impossible that the second coming of Christ could be through someone who was a Hindu. Well, you can take that in a variety of directions. Some of them may seem absolutely logical, and some of them may seem a little prejudiced. But then we can't know really about these things. We can only speculate. So the idea is, does Steiner's speculation seem to be more fruitful or helpful than Besant's, or no speculation? Personally, my feeling is if a world teacher shows up, I'll take a skeptical but open frame of mind. I'm better now than I was when I was about 12 years old, and a 12-year-old guru came from India called Maharaji. My Mother hid all the newspapers to make sure I didn't know where he was because she was afraid I would run away from home and join Maharaji. There was no danger of that, but mothers are mothers. So, in any case, I believe we have to learn discernment. And discernment means finding our own internal authority. And if there's any valid or helpful teaching that comes from any source, we should be open-minded about it, and we should never allow any authority to be absolute in our own world. So, Andy Besant and Krishnamurti had many, many followers, and people wanted so much for the world to be different after how broken it was after the First World War. There was value in giving inspiration to all these people and inspiring them to be helpful in the world in ways that people might not find time for now if they weren't working for some kind of special spiritual manifestation. But then we have someone like Benjamin Crane. Some of you may have heard of him. Every few years he announced the coming of the world teacher, and it didn't come, and then he did it again. And, people can believe the absolute logic of this sort of thing. Part of it is we're desperate to be saved. There are even spiritual groups where they're expecting a so-called space brother to come and save us from the world. Well, all the spiritual teachings that I consider worthwhile say, you have to save yourselves.
Yes.
So,
We are the ones we are waiting for.
yeah, yes. So, it's a long answer to the question about Steiner. I find much of value in Steiner, and I have some question marks, and I have some to be investigated, and I have some, I don't think so, and as far as I know, that's healthy. And I'm allowed, as a theosophist, to have these thoughts, as long as I'm not in a lodge that says, no Steiner. Luckily, there aren't so many of those anymore. However, I've also noticed that anthroposophists and theosophists, despite the similar basis, are, it's not easy to make friends across that boundary.
That's changing as well.
I haven't noticed it so much in America. And you're in a special situation here because you're involved with the Theosophical Centre. I think it's wonderful that the organizations are making an attempt to find some kind of common ground. And yet, there's always the feeling of, well, come over to our side, In any case, my belief is that whatever we call theosophy is our own personal construction from all of the teachers that we find of value, and that the Theosophical Society should be a safe container within which we have the options to do that, and can be shown a few things we may not have thought about, but not forced in any sense to believe in. Just a moment, question here.
It's not so much a question, but some of it feels a little bit entitled to think that that's the only way a teacher can come through. Like Ramana Maharshi is certainly some very valid teacher, but he does not come from this tradition, so he's in a sense ignored. In the West, I'm saying,
They say that when the student is ready, you find the teacher, but I think it's the other way around. I think that the teachers are everywhere, and we're ready for whatever they have to offer. And if we get beaten up in the process, it's because that's what we were ready for. We didn't have enough discernment. If we have more discernment, then we wait a little longer. If we have too much, we find no spiritual teacher. So we have to be open-minded about every possibility. I always look into new things. And I have my prejudices, but I can often find something of value in just about any spiritual teaching, and sometimes I pass it on, and sometimes I say what the source is, and sometimes I don't, because it might create some difficulties. But the idea is, and this is, well, I'll say this, let me make sure I get this said in the right way. There's a fundamental truth behind all spiritual truths, but all spiritual truths are limited because they're expressed in language. And if you can feel through the language to the truth, you're fine. And if you can feel through different languages to the same truth behind each one, then you're in good shape. So we have, as the second object of the Theosophical Society, comparative study of science, religion, and philosophy. And I believe the reason for that is so that we develop our inner senses, so that we can feel the truth behind what is fundamentally true in science, in religion, in philosophy. People who read the secret doctrine often have great difficulty. It's not just the 19th century language, but Blavatsky makes a statement and then she backs it up with 5 quotations from old sources, none of which seem to have any relevance to what she was just talking about. Was she a bad writer, or did she know what she was doing? I think she knew what she was doing. For her, the 5 quotations all came from the same inner energetic source as the thing she was talking about before. And if you meditate on that, you find your way to it. And if you do that, you've embodied what she was trying to teach. And you can carry it with you as an ability that allows you to read anything and feel the truth behind it. Not very many people read the collected writings of Blavatsky. It's an intimidating project because there are 14 volumes, and many of them are over 400 pages. All of her articles are contained there. I don't think they're translated in many languages besides English, but I found in reading those, each article is a look at some aspect of the truth from a particular angle, and it's very valuable to see how that works, and then to learn to develop it for yourself as a way of looking at the world. So for me, it was almost more of an education than reading the secret doctrine, because it was telling me how I could think and not telling me what I should think, which I think too often is what we do with foundational texts like the secret doctrine. Any other questions before we break for lunch?
Yes.
Thank you. You said teaching you how to think, not what you think. Can you teach us?
I hope I'm doing it. Somebody take the microphone, please. Yes. I think when we do the workshops, we'll move somewhat in that direction. And if you feel that you're not getting it, keep asking me questions. And because whatever I am able to say to you will be of value for everyone in the group. Okay? Yes, you're welcome. Well, let's end our morning session then, and see you all at lunch, and then back here at 2 o'clock.